achieved as we reach towards the end of our 3 years in operation, CRC, and also where a significant part of our first tranche of projects are now in its final year of research, and there's a lot of outputs coming up from that. Concurrent with that, of course, is that we are now in the process of developing what the second tranche of projects would look like. And of course, fundamentally, the second tranche of projects is really about how do we secure the learnings from the first tranche in the most effective way for you, our end users, and then identifying what are some of the remaining knowledge gaps that we need to address that are really important to securing a water-sensitive city, water-sensitive municipality, or a water-sensitive organization as such. So this is just a quick overview. There's a lot to say, and what we've done is to try and make it as locally relevant as possible, but there are some Australia-wide achievement that we like to celebrate as well. And I'll start by this diagram. This diagram is our investment strategy. Basically, that talks about the notion that the CRC set out to do 3 specific things. To undertake research, but to undertake research across many disciplines. To synthesize the research that we do such that we can use the knowledge gain to develop context-specific solutions that addresses the unique opportunities and constraints of the project that you work in or the city you work in, and so on. And finally, the third mission we have is to then, with the knowledge gain, to influence decision-making, to influence policy, to influence practice. Those are our 3 missions. And our investment strategy, of course, as you can see from this diagram in here, that initially, we are, of course, investing a lot on developing and undertaking our research projects. We have also commenced to ramp up, as you see, our investment in terms of how much we would spend on synthesizing the research outputs as the research outputs come through. And by looking at different contexts, different urban development scenarios, different climate, different institutional settings, we will start to form views on how or what position was in fact the best position for us to start to think about influencing policy, influencing government decision, and so on. We are now very close to the 3rd year of our 9-year CRC. You can see that our projects, first tranche of projects, will start to ramp down as we commence in this period a combination of the conclusion of tranche 1 and the commencement of tranche 2. So you can see that tranche 1 projects, which if you like, are much more focused around the disciplines and getting much more detailed knowledge of individual disciplines, to a tranche 2 project that now very much will start to focus a lot more on the applications of the knowledge that we've got. And how we look at this impact chain, as we call it, is that how do you deliver impact in industry? You've got to have knowledge. Embedded in the knowledge that we generate is, of course, how we synthesize that knowledge because of the different disciplines and different lenses that we look at, from the social lens all the way to technology. And as we synthesize it, we need to be able to know how we implement them. And hopefully, at the end of the CRC, we would be in this area whereby we're looking at mainstreaming a different kind of practice, a water-sensitive approach to urban development, a water-sensitive approach to urban water management. The first tranche of projects sits very much in this arena. We are working in the interface between knowledge generation and synthesis. That's where the CRC works at the moment. We spend a lot of our effort undertaking research, and we spend a lot of our effort synthesizing the outputs from all the different disciplines to make it coherent, to make it meaningful for our partners. We occasionally, when the opportunity presents itself, and there are often opportunities, and there are a few that I could name, even in Melbourne, the project out at Officer, the project out at Aqua River, the project out of Fishermans Bay, we tend to reach out a little bit to basically have a snippet on looking at how some of our activities can in fact be realized within the time frame of this CRC, as in being built on the ground, and that would be fantastic. We also have projects internationally, for instance, in the city of Kunsan in China, whereby perhaps the land development, the rate of land development is quite different, and that we have a lot of certainty that a lot of work we do in synthesizing our research to their projects could in fact be implemented within this lifetime of this CRC, which is great. The type of activities we do within this first tranche of projects could be grouped into those following headlines. And I really want to use them to, if you like, categorize the achievements that we have made over the last 3 years. For instance, in research. In research, we have achieved, of course, a lot, because that's where we started our investments. But some of the highlights, for instance, is that if you look at our program in future technologies, we have been very specific in how we pool our programs, our projects together within this program to deliver an integrated water solution. For instance, in the drinking water area, we have done a fair bit of work to look at how we could better manage demand of our consumers. And I'll talk a little bit about that. A significant breakthrough in one of our very simple big data software has led to significant savings in being able to identify where the low-hanging fruits are for water conservation practices. We've also, in stormwater, have done a fair bit of work to look at how we can characterize the quality of stormwater where it can be, where key contaminants that determine its usefulness as an alternative resource is in fact quite different from the traditional stormwater characterization of suspended solids, phosphorus, and nitrogen. We've done that, and in fact that was the very beginning of stormwater management. But issues of pathogens and micropollutants, in fact, are the type of contaminants that you need to know if you want to consider stormwater as an alternative resource. And out of the stormwater work, we have also now been able to develop hybrid solutions whereby technology that in fact came from the old stormwater quality management for the protection of the receiving waters, how that work is being enhanced to ensure that it removes pathogens and micropollutants, are now being tested to develop hybrid solution that could deal with stormwater and grey water, same system. We've also looked at wastewater, whereby that program is very much looking at wastewater ultimately as a resource. Not just as a resource for its water, but its resource as the nutrients that are contained in it, and of course energy. And there's a lot of work that the CRC is part of, not exclusively done by the CRC. Many organizations are looking at wastewater as a resource, but the CRC is certainly contributing to that space. And you can see from this that the whole program in the future technologies is geared towards delivering an integrated water solution as a resource. And of course, there is ultimately a model-based decision support to determine which catchment best to prioritize if you're looking at stormwater harvesting, for instance, and where and how would you actually start to think about preparing wastewater stream to optimize its extraction of nutrients from that wastewater and so on. Another piece of work which I'm sure all of you are familiar with in terms of our research is of course the work that we've done on microclimate, and how the work we've done to date have been able to develop heat vulnerability maps in every capital cities in Australia. The heat vulnerability map was first developed to help inform water-sensitive strategy for that city. We all know, and we have evidence now to show, that water-sensitive urban design can reduce the urban heat and can improve microclimate. But the heat vulnerability mapping was one of those work that we did that was able to now say, given that we have the evidence that water-sensitive urban design can improve microclimate, we are also mapping for you how you could prioritize the rollout of water-sensitive urban design according to the heat vulnerability mapping. One of the unintended consequences of the heat vulnerability map is that, in fact, emergency services are using that map to help plan their emergency services in an imminent heat wave conditions. And in fact, there are some evidence, and I would like to claim that entirely, although I like to think that we have contributed to it, that there are evidence that the fact that the last significant heat wave in Melbourne actually led to a 50% reduction in mortality and morbidity compared to 2 years ago had a lot to do with emergency services being able to respond appropriately and also being able to alert neighbors to check on their neighbors and so on, based around the heat vulnerability mapping. We've also done a fair bit of work to understand water literacy in Australia. One of the things that we know is that the social component of empowering community to work with us in developing a water-sensitive future has to do with, first of all, understanding how much does the community actually understand water? How much do they understand scarcity of water? How much do they understand where their stormwater goes to? Now, how much do they understand the actions that they do in terms of littering and how that may impact on receiving water? How much do they understand where sewer goes to? So we undertook a pretty extensive survey of over 5,000 Australians all over the country and asked them a whole series of questions. And these are some of the questions, answers we were looking for in terms of understanding their literacy. And the numbers are not good. This is really a map of the water literacy of Australians. The percentage shows the percentage of those surveyed that actually got 50% of the answers right. Okay, and you can see here that our friends in Queensland are perhaps the most water literate, in that 20% of those surveyed was able to answer 50% of the questions correctly. Victorians don't fare very well, and we may be surprised by that because we thought that the type of social capital that we achieve in terms of our water behavior, our water conservation behavior could actually lift it high. But perhaps there are some other issues that perhaps Victorians do not fully appreciate or understand. But what is the value of that work? Is that the value of that work is now able to help us develop the social marketing and messaging that we need to pull together to start to inform our community. And through informing our community, we could progressively lift and empower them to become a lot more proactive and to be a lot more forward in developing, co-developing strategies with government, with local government, with researchers, and perhaps progressively move towards an era of co-development, co-ownership of strategy, co-ownership of the risks associated with such strategies. For instance, this whole issue of droughts and floods, they are risk-related, and we need to understand risks. And before we can actually build resilience, both physical and social resilience to a lot of these hazards, we actually need to ensure that there is social empowerment and knowledge of where water comes from. So that work is now leading to another of our team, which is looking at behavior change and looking at that information and developing the proper messaging for fostering behavior change. The other thing we do in tranche projects is to commence research collaboration. And this is one which actually goes without saying, that the CRC in itself is a highly collaborative organization. The first C of the CRC is cooperative. We have 13 research organizations that undertake research. We have 34 projects involving those 13 organizations. We have sitting behind them, for instance, 34 local governments that are our end users, or often I call our change agents, whereby they would take the outputs from our research and start to look at implementing them. They would collaborate with us to inform us in terms of how our research could in fact be translated and explained such that it would be meaningful for them. Similarly, we have 7 different sectors, industry sectors that work with us. The state government departments and agencies, the state-owned enterprises like the water utilities, there is a community group sector, there is the land development sector, and of course there's a commercial consultancy, private enterprise sector. An example of how a program can also deliver collaboration is of course the one in Program B that looks at water-sensitive urbanism. In here, the entire program is being developed to ensure collaboration that brings in issues of ecosystem health, urban climatology, and flood resilience into a planning framework that is looking at how planning can also be a very useful platform that brings in the different science to deliver what we call science-informed planning pathway. An example of that, which we have commenced, is this whole issue of flood resilience. Researchers from our international partners together with our Australian partners are about to commence work looking at delivering flood resilience in the area of Elwood. In that project, we are actually commencing with community envisioning to actually try and get a sense of what the community looks for in terms of delivering a flood resilience Elwood, in addition to their perception of what livability is and how other issues of the quality of the beach, the quality of the waterway would come into it, and how we would deliver all of that together as part of the strategy while addressing the primary concern, that being to ensure flood resilience. This is just a map, and it's a busy map that actually talks about how all the different projects within the CRC are actually contributing to this project at the moment. And the colors are actually coded to the different programs. We have 4 research programs, and within the 4 research programs, there could be any number of 5 to 11 projects within those programs, and that's what those numbers stands for. We have program from Program B, the water-sensitive urbanism program, Program A, which is the society program, Program C, the technology program, and Program D, the adoption pathway program, all coming together at a single point to look at building flood resilience in Elwood. The community envisioning has commenced with a website that is now running, and communities members encouraged to actually contribute to that website in terms of determining what they see are examples of livability within their community that ought to go into this vision setting for Elwood. Within Tranche 1, we also deliver proof of concept. In proof of concept, I just wanted to highlight 2 things. We have, of course, well before the commencement of this CRC, have stormwater biofiltration being developed and delivered in terms of proof of concept on its ability to remove some of the key contaminants that impacts on the quality of our waterways, suspended solids, nitrogen, and phosphorus. But over time, we have now delivered proof of concept that these systems remove pathogens and they do remove micropollutants. And it is this proof of concept that enables us to now move into prototyping in terms of how these systems are being used for stormwater harvesting, grey water harvesting. Another significant proof of concept that we have in a different project is in terms of our urban climate. This is about downscaling global climate predictions of what future climate, future weather would be for a local area, but downscaling it to a scale that is meaningful to you and me. And that is really at a scale of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grids. I'll give you an example. If you're interested in stormwater harvesting in Melbourne or in Elwood for that matter, and you're interested in testing the resilience of that system to future climatic scenarios, there's no point having the global model tell us what Australia would experience, where Australia is represented by best maybe 3 or 4 cells within a global model. It means nothing to us, or we can't do anything to it. And quite often, to this point in time, we use very simple solutions to say, what if rainfall increased by 10% and what if decreased by 10%? But we don't actually capture the finer detail of what it means on a day-to-day basis. This work is able to combine radar information that is observed that captures the distribution of rainfall on an hourly basis, historical radar information, and combine that with synoptic boundary information that actually drives weather in, say, the whole region of Melbourne. And is able to do that and deliver the proof of concept that we are able to predict what the likely future trends are for the city of Melbourne based on boundary conditions that the global models are producing. So now there is a consistency between what the global model is doing, and that's constantly evolving and improving, and how that could translate back to what it means for Melbourne, what it means for Elwood, what it means for Sydney, Brisbane, and so on. That work is underrated at the moment. I see it as a significant breakthrough because it gives us now the mechanism to test resilience. That work is now being used in Singapore, as our Singapore partners are very excited to see how this would compare in a tropical thunderstorm situation whereby there is even more uncertainty about being able to predict long-term trends in thunderstorm activities. And it's being trialed in Singapore as an example of how we're expanding the work that we've done. We also, as part of Tranche 1, start to look at how we would develop, how we would provide the evidence to develop the business case for water sensitivity. This is very important for our end users to continue to help them to argue the case for change and reform. Our job is to provide them with the evidence, the scientific evidence, to enable them to do the work. We have, in fact, undertaken a workshop that tries and capture as much of our early learnings as possible. And this was in 2014, where we ran a workshop whereby every research projects and program was asked to basically say, on the basis of the work you've done to date, can you provide us with some evidence or some guidance to help someone develop the business case for a water-sensitive city? We ran that workshop in Sydney over 2 days, collated a whole bunch of information, published a very first draft, if you like, guidelines on how you would develop a business case, at least to provide guidelines on what questions to ask if someone wanted to develop the business case. And what was very interesting was that a year on, we actually went back to the participants of that workshop and asked them whether they are still using that information that they learned from the workshop. And the results of that is actually for me, quite promising. First of all, 89% of the industry participants agree that the workshop met its intended. A year on, 27 had used the documents, 20% say it's given them confidence to advocate for certain actions, and 20% say it provided information and evidence to support. So for us, there is, for a 2-day workshop, there is actually quite a significant retention of what we're doing. But what is important is that we have created a document that will be a living document. It provides a placeholder for a lot of our research to now continue to populate that information. It provided a framework on how you would develop a business case, and this provides a clear sense of direction for a lot of our researchers to know what they have to do to continue to strengthen such a framework. We undertake ground truthing as part of our Tranche 1 projects. And the one that I really want to talk about is just this one, which is about demand management. The work by Professor Rachel Cardo-Oliver from University of WA has been groundbreaking, and often is one of those silent achievers that we don't hear a lot about. it was all a simple case of that in the Water Corporation of WA were particularly concerned with the whole sustainability of how they were supplying water to Kalgoorlie. Kalgoorlie's water supply is actually pumped from Perth. And as you know, Perth is into its third desalination plant. So one of the things they did was to roll out significant water meters. But you know, it's be careful what you wish for, because when you roll out water meters, you got a huge load of data that you actually do not know what to do with. And so Professor Cardo Oliver actually developed an algorithm to help decipher and go through huge amount of data to identify very quickly where the low-hanging fruits are for water conservation measures. And a simple task like that has led to, for instance, the Minister for Water at that time making the announcement that that work in Kalgoorlie itself has saved them $1 million a year in water conservation by identifying low-hanging fruits. You know, by picking some of the heavy users and tackling that first, they were able to save $1 million just in addressing that. The result of that is that water metering is incredibly popular now in WA, whereby that technique has now been able to justify the use of water meter to effectively have strong water conservation outcomes. So the next round, the minister really was to set up water metering in the Pilbara. And so you can see here that some very simple work in looking at a clever algorithm is really able to make most out of the data that we've got. That ground truthing is now, we anticipate, going to lead to significant uptake of water conservation measures through such systems. We also developed tools in our first tranche of projects. And the tool that most of you are familiar with is, of course, our water sensitivity toolkit. This is, again, if you like, a placeholder that enables our researchers to know where their research is going to finish up. This is a modeling toolkit that initially captures issues of water-sensitive urban design and its role in reducing urban climate heat. Water-sensitive urban design in improving the environmental health of waterways. Water-sensitive urban design in harvesting stormwater as a resource. Water-sensitive urban design as a reduction in flood peaks for geomorphic protection of our natural waterways and so on. That tool has recently been used, now it's gone through its pilot testing stage. It is now available for use, albeit still very clunky because we haven't converted it into a commercial software as yet. But in fact was used in one of the research synthesis work, a project that we did for the development in Aqua River. And this is just one of those examples of showing how, through water-sensitive urban design and a greening strategy, that you can actually improve the temperature of the surround. And this is a chart that I don't really want to spend too much time explaining, other than to say that the gray block is actually the heat profile of a neighboring development next to Aqua River, which is subject to development. And in fact shows that on that particular day, there was some 70% of that area was subject to a temperature of 32 degrees on that day. With the approach that we adopted for Aqua River, same area and adjoining development, we were able to find that the greening of streets and keeping water in the landscape was able to reduce the area that was subject to 32 degrees down from 70% to 30%. Okay? And of course, there has got to be a corresponding increase, and that's where the increase, the bulk of the increases has come from, is in those two areas. So you can see that there is actually a shedding of temperature simply through how we develop our development. And I'll come back to Aqua River in a minute. We, in Tranche 1, also undertake demonstration projects. In our Tranche 1 projects, in our demonstration, the one that perhaps many of you would be familiar with is in fact a legacy project from our cities as water supply catchment, whereby some of you may have been part of that group that went out to this paddock in the development and officer, and we introduced concepts of ecological sponges that basically provide that buffering. they became based around a Melaleuca swamp model, but based around water filtration as well. That's been constructed, and last year it won the Landscape Architectural Award, that project itself. And as you go out there and you see it now, you can see an amazing waterway riparian. If you walk through it, you would understand and relate to how things are being built whereby natural floodplain processes are being mimicked and reproduced to protect the ecology and the hydrology of the waterway in Gumscrub Creek. Finally, Tranche 1 looks at integrated solution, the synthesis, as I said, of a lot of our research outputs. And there are many to talk about, but I won't talk about all of them, just a handful. First of all, in the first 3 years, we have undertaken 5 research synthesis projects, and these are the 5. The 5 we looked at, Bactavia out in the city of Geraldton, out in Western Australia, Aqua River, which is just outside of Melbourne, Townsley, which is in Adelaide, in 8 kilometers from the CBD in Adelaide, Fishermans Bay, we all know about, just across the river here, and Ripley, which is just outside of the city of Ipswich in Queensland. This gives you the scale of the work that we have done in terms of the population that they serve, and in terms of the number of dwellings and the area, sorry. Combination of infill development, brownfield development, and greenfield development. As we speak, at this point, we have completed 3 other research syntheses, all of which were in WA. 2 in rural WA, and we just finished just last week a brownfield development in the city of Perth. We plan next year to undertake 10 research syntheses. And why are they important? They're really important because it provides a context for the integration of all our research. Aqua River, for instance, was a project that Southeast Water is developing in partnership with Villawood, the developers. They basically, is a greenfield site that is actually a greenfield site stuck in the middle of what is largely a developed area. Existing infrastructure that it needs to connect to, and its topographic conditions are such whereby levels are not crash hot. But to cut a very long story short, one of the things that generated from a lot of this is the notion of how a central spine of an urban forest could provide all the necessary conditions of what we call the short-run streets. A short-run street simply means that you can actually keep a lot of your water, storm water, on the surface on natural systems without needing those natural systems to be very wide or take up a lot of space. If all the catchments of those short-run streets are small catchments, they can deliver the 5-year service without the need for a pipe. But more importantly, that means you do not have to have a drainage that is already a meter and a half below the ground before you even start. So by enabling that to occur, it actually starts to give you some advantages in terms of cut and fill and how you would tilt the land to drain naturally to those systems. But it also provides significant microclimate benefits in terms of how you would run the green corridor all the way back up into the streets. So that was sort of the early concepts that led to that sketch, which was a sketch done after 1 day of research synthesis. This was the final submission to the planning authority in terms of how they would like, in terms of the application for development in there. And for me, this is actually, whether it is completely attributed to that workshop or not, it nevertheless shows the value of the work we do in influencing the actual application of land development in this case. The one that, of course, I want to talk about is the big end of town, Fishermans Bay. Irrespective of whether the Fishermans Bay boundaries have now expanded, whether the development scenarios and conditions have changed, the fact was that this is going to be the biggest urban development in Melbourne. there is, for instance, anticipated to be some $30 billion of private sector investment in this 258 hectare site. From a water servicing perspective, it's anticipated to be $500 million of water infrastructure to be introduced in Fishermans Bay. From the CRC's perspective, these are all the partners that are CRC partners that have a stake in Fishermans Bay. And of course, this slide will need to change because the Office for Living Victoria is now replaced by the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. But nevertheless, the Victorian government is a significant stake, has a significant stake in Fishermans Bay. Melbourne Water, City West Water, City Southeast Water have a stake. The City of Melbourne, City of Port Phillip, Department of Health, and also our commercial partner GHD are in fact appointed consultant to advise on this development as well for Southeast Water. The work that we've done have basically identified again the notion of how would you service a site that is a contaminated site, is flood prone, and now we're putting about 100,000 people in it, and how do we ensure along the way that livability is being promoted. The whole idea again of thinking about a green spine that frames the whole development was talked about. The green spine provides a couple of things: safe passage for flood water, water cleansing when it's not flooding, and also creating urban microclimate in terms of how it reaches to the different development lots. It also provides public spaces that defines the quality of the public realm that ultimately determines the quality of living, the livability of what is going to be a very high density precinct. Some of the outputs, for instance, are looking at the notion of what we call green canyons, the relationship between trees, green walls, and the fact that many of the developments and the architecture were to be developed on podiums to reduce the need for excavation in what is a contaminated site. Immediately when you see that developments are in podium, you can actually use gravity to again look at how you would deliver water, stormwater runoff to the surface rather than deliver it under the ground, and therefore again reduces the need for infrastructure to be below the ground, but also enable water to be celebrated as part of the natural landscape. Passive watering then becomes simple. You can deliver green corridor that is passively watered by our wonderful Melbourne weather, reliable as they are, and maintain the type of greenery without the need for any irrigation. The notion of green walls was put in place, but the green walls being the system that would start to combine with building architecture for grey water treatment and grey water harvesting, and how harvested grey water could then become a resource for the building. But when we ask the question about what would we use the grey water for, that actually start to become really interesting. It became very apparent when we looked at that, and please don't get thrown off by this idea, by the flow chart here. It became very apparent that when you have that many high rises in there, wastewater recycling alone is a demand limited situation, in that you will always have more wastewater than you can actually use in that development. And you will continue to have a higher than desired demand of importing water from the mains, because drinking water, the demand for drinking water standard is always going to be much more than what could be supplied, even if you were to turn rainwater into drinking water. So when we actually look at the synthesis, we realize that we need to deliver a no-regret strategy, whereby we do know, in fact, there are technologies today that can take grey water to drinking standard. It's just that perhaps legislatively, regulation, we're not ready for it, but we need to actually prepare for it. So what we did, and when we did the analysis to show that the minute we look at grey water greywater and rainwater to drinking standards, we find that we are now in a supply-limited scenario rather than a demand-limited scenario, which means that we can actually use greywater and rainwater to significantly reduce the amounts of mains water that we import into this scenario. So we have come to a strategy whereby we can initially start with greywater for non-potable reuse, but ultimately that greywater could be delivered for drinking standard, and we need to think about the infrastructure to do that such that there is a no regrets infrastructure rollout for this system. Now, what I want to talk about now is that was what we have done in Tranche 1, and this is what we will complete by the time we finish Tranche 1 projects. Tranche 2 is where we are about to commence developing. In Tranche 2, you can see that what we hope to do is to move, if you like, this left line a little bit to the right, which means that we are going to emphasize less on knowledge generation. And this line has moved significantly to the right to basically say we're going to emphasize a lot more on implementation. How do we use the knowledge that we've acquired in implementation? We are now wanting to work in two interfaces. The interface between knowledge generation and synthesis, and the intersection between synthesis and implementation. And of course, we will, when the opportunity presents itself, reach out into mainstreaming, which is really what we want to do. And of course, when the opportunity presents itself, reach back into more fundamental knowledge generation. But generally, this is where we want to focus on. And you can see that the group of activities would expand into issues of performance assessment, strategy development, standards, developing standards, and can't read it, policies, strengthening integrated solutions, and so on. So that's where we want to move to in our second tranche of projects. Not completely ignore what we have done, but ensuring that appropriate resources are now pushed out to this out here, and that requires us to actually work a lot closer with our industry partners, because in the end, we are now moving across to their arena into the implementation phase. One of the things I'll talk about is that we are already doing some of those work. One that I want to mention is in the tools. We have commenced developing the Water Sensitive City Index. That is an index that allows us to assess a municipality, a city, or a project in terms of how water sensitive is it. But in that assessment, we would have identified all the things that could be done to lift its water sensitivity rating. And those things that could be done, if you can sort of imagine one of those typical McKinsey charts, it will identify what the low-hanging fruits are. What are the easy things that you can do to lift its water sensitivity a lot quicker. And we hope that the two together with that identification of what could be done could then form the basis of a strategic plan for the city and an investment plan for the city in ultimately transforming itself to a water-sensitive city. This has captured a lot of imagination and interest around the world. In fact, this was mentioned particularly by the Commonwealth government in their review of our CRC as one that will ultimately identify the brand of what we're doing. I just received an email a couple of days ago from the World Bank that now wants to start to think about trialing the index in their client countries. So it is very exciting. That I'm hopeful that an inquiry from the World Bank will ultimately mean more funding for the CRC. They're certainly not going to get it for nothing. And of course, we're close to completing prototyping with a number of local governments. The prototyping was important to make sure that the indicators we develop and the data required to determine those indicators are not arduous and that it's not impossible to get. And if they are, we will examine if there is a surrogate or a qualitative way of determining the value of those indicators. We are now coming back together, having completed the prototyping, to work out what adjustments we need to do before on the 1st of July we commence the piloting of the index across the 3 cities, Brisbane, Melbourne and Perth, and probably some other international cities. So out of all of that, we are moving into tranche 2. We are about to commence a series of development workshops, project development workshops. It will start with a needs and opportunity analysis for each city to identify what are specific needs of Melbourne in terms of how they would utilize the knowledge generated from tranche 1, what would be some of the impediments to their utilizations, what is it we need to do as projects to overcome those impediments, and finally, what are some of the important knowledge gaps that still needs to be addressed as part of tranche 2 to make the transformation of Melbourne into a water-sensitive city. We're doing exactly the same in Perth, in Brisbane, in Sydney. Our friends in Adelaide are in fact coming to the Melbourne workshop to have a mini subgroup related to Adelaide so that we can address that. And the whole idea is that at the end of those workshops, we would have a clear understanding of the different trajectories and different transformation pathways that each city needs. And we will then start to develop a series of projects that would address those needs as best we can. But with Melbourne, because of the size of our partnership in Melbourne, I can virtually say for certain that there will be one whole program, transition program dedicated to Melbourne to address the transformation of Melbourne through the tranche 2 projects. So I invite you to look out for that. There will be some discussions after this breakfast to actually start to talk about dates for this workshop. But we have made commitments that the workshop and the analysis will be completed by the end of this year so that project development can be completed by the middle of next year. So thank you for that. Thank you for your attention.